So as John mentioned, I've just come out of the process of writing, and it's one of those sort of alienating things where your head is so deep in this particular set of arguments, and you put it together so that it makes some kind of sense to you, and then you sort of have to step out and see if it makes any sense to anyone at all, besides you and your supervisor, who create this sort of hermetic seal. So it's great to have the opportunity to chat with you today. As John mentioned, my background is as an artist. I play the piano. I've spent about a dozen years running an arts organization in eastern Newfoundland. And I guess I've grown up in the world, that sort of very demanding, rigorous, and yet very enriching world of the arts. And it's probably no surprise then that when it looked like sustainability really wasn't going to sort itself out, I started to wonder what the role of the arts might be. And when I started to dig into this, when I began studying with John and looking at the art-sustainability relationship in greater detail, I was really surprised by two things. First of all, how prevalent that instinct was, just how many people were starting to look at the arts as a way of addressing questions of sustainability. And then on the other hand, how problematic it was in a way that I felt as a practicing artist. There was something that was just getting missed in the way that process was breaking down. Particularly, by and large, artists were being approached, or the arts were being approached, as some kind of alchemist for hire, something that could come along and turn facts into values, so that scientific languages could give us the truths about sustainability, and then it was the job of the arts to come along and make people actually care about that. And from the perspective of an artist wanting to get into that, that approach kind of sucks for a variety of reasons. And so I thought I'd just try and give you a bit of background as to, at least from my perspective, what gets lost in the shuffle when we approach things that way. So somebody said this is working now. Yes, it is. So my instinct about this is the aesthetic realm is something I think of as an informing agency. And that agency is things like the agency of pattern and form, line, color, texture, rhythm, harmony, imagery, metaphor, etc. But it's tempting, but I think incorrect to think of these as properties that artists use. I think we have to think more along the lines that these are properties that artists listen to, or perhaps even more precisely, though perhaps a little more metaphysically, they're properties that artists listen with. And I think it's very important to think of creativity as a responsive interaction with the more than human. And so I think we're tempted to trust art in the way that we do, and by that I would mean indulge a certain beauty-truth correlation, a certain kind. I don't want to go too far with that, because they offer a meaningful encounter with agencies beyond ourselves. But when we strap that process to an instrumental agenda, when we get down to the business of trying to use art, what we usually do is we turn that listening back into using, and then we disenchant the power for which we sought its help in the first place. And so I figured that we really kind of needed to figure out how to draw a line in the sand that would sort of help the arts walk towards that nefarious world of politics in a way that didn't create so much problem there. And it was with this idea of art as epistemology, thinking of art as a means of inquiry, thinking of it as a way of finding things out, thinking of it as a way of knowing things. In very simple terms, art is a means to learn, but it's not a means to teach. And I think it's often getting used in the latter part. And it's a kind of epistemology that I think, when it's really at its best, it's the kind of epistemology that can sort of lead you to the edge of your conceptual map and then just let you peer over that in some way, show you a little bit of the territory that's not on the map, allow you to transgress your contextual rationality in some way. And so there's an idea that when you're gripped in that sort of aesthetic moment, when things are really working well, your capacity to know the world exceeds your capacity to name the world in some way. And so that sort of that kind of ontology experience thing starts to peel apart in some way. And so why I'm really interested in art, particularly as a sort of agent of transformation, is because of its capacity to offer you that ontological reflexivity, that sense that things always exceed the containers that we put them in. And I think this is why that instinct is so strong amongst different communities that are interested in using arts as a social change, because it can offer you that. But the irony is that that's usually the first thing that gets left behind when a research interest or a social interest grabs a hold of the arts to try and do something with it. Because it's so connected to a notion of epistemology, and that notion of epistemology is so connected to the aesthetic as its own kind of informing agency. And so the first research question that I took with this work was just how we enter that world of politics, or how we enter the world of the non-aesthetic without undermining what I felt was really important to the aesthetic process. I think it's very legitimate, though, to look at that and say, you know, this sort of passion for protecting ontological reflexivity, why is that at all important? Certainly the arguments for political or technological or legal reflexivity would be very obvious, but something so vague may not be self-evident. And I thought I'd answer that question because with this, I saw this on the wall upstairs, and I thought it's such an interesting cartoon. You know immediately how you're supposed to read this cartoon. This is sort of the language of you know, big business and corrupt media and maybe gullible publics that are there. But when I saw this, I actually thought of that scene from Lord of the Flies. I'm assuming everybody's got a familiarity with that, where all hell is breaking loose on the island, and Piggy's got the conch, and he's running around telling everybody that he's got the conch, and he's trying to get people to make people listen to him because he's holding this conch. And of course they don't listen to Piggy, and Piggy dies, and then the boys almost burn the island to the ground. But the question is, does that scene turn on whether the authority of the conch is sufficient to halt this descent into chaos? I mean, do you expect when you're in that moment that you're going to see the boys spot the conch, stop what they're doing, listen to Piggy, turn around and return to the world that they know? Or is it more about the futility of old symbols in a very new world? And with that in mind, when I'm engaged in that scene, I don't have any hope at all that Piggy's actually going to pull that off. I don't think that's what that scene is trying to say. And I felt when I was looking at that cartoon, I had the same level of hope for those poor scientists over there. They kind of reminded me of Piggy and the conch at that point. And the reason for that is because I think that, you know, when we're in that moment in that novel, the climax of that scene is not a problem for the conch to solve, but it's a problem about the conch as a way of solving problems. And so to get at that same issue without the literary reference, you could ask this in very blunt terms: is the challenge of sustainability a challenge to prove the world real, or a challenge to prove the world imaginary? It's an odd question to ask, but I think it's one that we answer without flinching all the time. You count up the hectares, you add up the fish, you calculate the parts per million, and then you tell people what to do. However, when we prove the world real, we dig ourselves deeper into the dichotomies of modernism. We do things like separate subjects from objects, facts from value, culture from nature. This is all pretty familiar stuff. And we do that out of this desire to know what the world is like while we're not there knowing it to be like that, or some would even say knowing it into being like that, which would be pushing it a little further. But what we end up usually is we end up stuck between the truth of facts that we can't experience, or the experience of values that we can't trust, and detachment, disenchantment, alienation, anxiety, futility. These are understandable outcomes, but also, I think, really familiar and well-discussed drivers of unsustainability. What I'm interested in exploring is actually going further into the kind of incoherence of that idea, because so much of the push that I've seen around climate activism is actually trying to get us to acknowledge the anthropogenic nature of the climate, that what we do and what we have done is so heavily determinant of the sky that's overhead. And I think what happens then is that that determination to prove the world real, given that context, drives us deeper into a condition that's marked by both irony and paradox. Irony in that our efforts to separate culture from nature have yielded this circumstance where they couldn't be more intertwined. And paradox in that human meaning and agency are actually increasingly necessary to grasping the non-human world. And so I imagine that we've come to this sort of strange place where politics and epistemology, meaning and knowing, the imaginary and the material actually flow together inextricably. A place where the kinds of values that we have about something like the climate have more to do, or at least as much to do, with the sort of facts that are to be told about it as the other way around. And that's why I think sustainability is just such an incredibly cool problem or set of problems, because it brings us to this place where our sort of newish experiences of reality are increasingly so out of step with the ways we typically conceive of self and world and other. And it seems like the ways in which we're trying to wriggle out from the tangle of these ropes actually are only sort of tightening the knots or deepening the irony and deepening the paradox. And so the second research question that I was interested in looking at is how do we start to operate beyond the dichotomies of modernism? What are the sort of practical and ontological difficulties? So how do we do it? And then once we've done it, what is it that we've actually done? And then what does sustainability look like when we try and do that? So I was very lucky to get to look at those two problems in one of John's big research projects, the Green City Conversations. This whole research project was actually about that second question of how do we build sustainability beyond those modernist dichotomies. And I got to look at it within an artistic frame. I was really lucky to work with a great group of artists. And it has been pointed out to me, and it is something that I'm a little bit self-conscious about, that it is a bunch of dudes on that list. Originally, we had really nice gender parity, but I'm sort of pleased to say that we lost both our female artists to better gigs. They got hired onto bigger paychecks and more prominent things. And so that's sort of maybe the best way that you can lose your gender balance, but we did try and strike that at one point. So these artists looked at these questions through their own fields. Don Mackay is, which is one of the great nature poets alive right now, and he had this idea of taking up this commission by looking for the wilderness of objects. And his thought was that everything has wilderness, like a chair and a coffee cup has wilderness. It's just that idea that there's always something in excess of your conceptual grasp of that thing. And you can go after that in some way with this beautiful phrase of his, by using language to demonstrate its own inadequacy, in a way that poetry is able to use words to show you the limits of their reach and actually attune you to the fact that there is something more beyond that. And when you have that moment where experience and language decouple, all that sort of objectification that you take into the world falls apart on you, at least enough, hopefully, that you have a little moment of reflexivity about it. Derek Kaplan was an architect who wanted to resurrect the approach of rock-cut architecture, and actually did something very similar to Don, except rather than language, he used high-tech parametric modeling software such that he could create very active design conversations with very inanimate elements, stone and sunlight in this case. And so what Derek did was that he would use, I mean, I don't really know how to describe the technology at all, but the sense that I had of it was he would sort of take a design proposal, put it into the computer, hit render, and then go to bed, and then the thing would render overnight. And he'd wake up the next day to see how the stone, the interaction between the stone and sunlight, reacted to his design proposal. And sort of the outcome that I loved at that is that he said that every single time he was absolutely wrong about how it was going to look, that it was always a surprise when he woke up in the morning. And he, I think, sort of got really wrapped up in a very active conversation with these things that usually are quite inanimate, and then finally ended up building a beautiful proposal for I guess a sort of a gathering space cut out of the side of a mountain. So if any of you have a mountain that you're not doing anything with. 3 minutes? Okay. So both of these took, the poetry and the architecture, took an approach of distributing agency within a creative process. The next two channels did something really different, where they actually tried to distribute agency as a creative product. So in other words, they were after trying to get the audience to be a part of creating the experience that the audience was having for itself. The Electric Company Theatre, based here in Vancouver, did that by splitting the audience into 3 groups and then creating the sort of very complicated narrative structures that fed them down through their own stories. This all took place at the Space Center down in Kitts. We sort of wandered through our own narrative lines, and then all of a sudden at these key moments would collide with another audience group. So you went from being the thing that was watching and consuming to suddenly being the thing that was being watched and consumed. The music chapter, this took place at SIRS, went even further in this direction, where the composer actually stepped out of the process almost entirely, other than to put these boxes on the floor and give instructions to the audience and to the musicians. The musicians were to react to the boxes in the ways that they wanted to, and the audience was to try and provoke musical reactions by moving in and out of the boxes. And so there was a sort of almost a desire to, I'll try and use a biology word just to show off to Gerald, but like an autopoietic musical system here that would sort of supply music by itself. Generally, I felt that this was such a disappointment. I don't really know any other way to describe it, but I think it was really useful in the ways that it was a disappointment, because the idea here was that we were going to become an audience that had suddenly more agency about our experience, because we weren't sort of sitting back passively receiving this music, but we were up on our feet creating the experience. But the composer stepped so far out of the experience that there was absolutely nothing structuring the engagement between the musicians and the audience, and so what we were left with was a process that actually never had the means to separate signal from noise, that never had the means to start to build something that was musical in any way. And so the outcomes and implications for the questions that I set up at the beginning are really too numerous to go into, but just try and follow one track to close. That once we start with this idea of art as epistemology or creativity as inquiry, we end up in a context of distributed agency. And once we're there, we're in the hands of emergent dynamics in a very strong way. What seemed to spell success or failure or happiness for the arts, for the different art projects from this commission, really was how well those emergent dynamics were managed. And I sort of came to a sense of emergent dynamics as a tool rather than a self-evident virtue. There's such a sort of normative push behind maxing out your emergent dynamics, and I really had a different sense of this at the end of the project than going into it. And so one of the things that was fun to look at with the different the different art commissions was just the different strategies that the artists used for trying to handle the emergent dynamics that they found themselves wrapped up in. One of which was obviously this role of expertise. What does the expert do once sort of in that field of emergent interactivity? And so I tried to kind of generalize this for a broader audience as best I could. We all know what the old way was, the sort of autocratic transmitter of information, or I was thinking that a Scientologist would just call them an ATI. But of course no one at IRES would ever dare to be that kind of expert, because we're all so well-heeled in things like the situated and democratic notions of knowledge production. And so I think we're all kind of somewhere in the sort of new way. The motivation for breaking down expert lay boundaries is often described in literature as having three key motivations: instrumental, normative, substantive. The reason that I'm being a little bit stubborn in calling it the sort of new way is I think that if this is a departure from modernism, we're sort of riding out of that town on a Trojan horse. That embedded in that is still the same distinction between the political and the epistemological. And so once we step into the imaginary world, or the post-normal world, or the non-modern world, or the Anthropocene, I think all those things are interchangeable. Then we have a different situation on our hands, where public agency is constitutive of the entity to at least some degree that we're trying to describe. And so the expert context has to take two things into account. Publics are an animating force. In other words, ontology depends very much on meaning. And this is the increased agency of publics, and I think that's a fairly common understood idea. What became more and more clear to me digging away at the arts channels was the second idea, that if ontology depends on meaning, I think that meaning still depends on the experts to translate that engagement into these more than human worlds. And where we saw the artists try and step way back from that process out of some idea of a sort of purified emergent outcome was actually where that thing collapsed. And I feel like there's a need to, as we step into these sort of new ways of accounting for reality, to still hang on to the persistent agency of experts. And I think that applies to scientists that are trying to move in this direction, or artists, or political people as well. So I tried to do, really I just tried to learn how to use PowerPoint better, but I tried to put this into some sort of graph that might illustrate what I'm talking about. That we start with expert descriptions, that engages the public imagination, creates meaning, stabilizes value, and animates the entity, which then the public sort of describes or redescribes, and we go around in a circle. Obviously, I think there's an arrow missing where flowing into that animate the entity, obviously most of the time the entity is also busy animating itself, and I feel bad for leaving it out of the loop. But then the question comes, and I'll just close with this, how do we take all that and go back to fixing the climate? And building on this very interesting work by Mike Hume that John put me on, the kind of perplexing answer is we don't. It's not that we take this new sense of self and world and get back to fixing the problem, but from Mike Hume's perspective, we take the problem and use that as the leverage that lifts us into new existential projects that fix us. Or in other words, and to reduce Mike Hume to a soundbite, we flip the sustainability predicate. That we go from the idea that humans are here to solve climate change to climate change is here to solve humans. And that's sort of how I try and draw another line in the sand that helps us think about how we approach things like climate change once we're in this notion of the imaginary world. This slide is not something that we're going to go through. It's just sort of my confessional slide that says, you know, a little bit of knowledge actually breeds a whole lot more ignorance. And so these are the sorts of questions that I think outline what we're talking about when we're approaching this idea of sustainability in the imaginary world. And so clearly a lot of research to be done and a lot more to learn, but that's as far as we got so far. So thank you very much. Hadi? Hello.
Lovely talk.
Thank you.
The Human Dimensions program of the National Science Foundation was predicated on that way.
Oh, is that right? So I need to put a little sort of asterisk at it?
Just wanted to let you know that a bunch of us were with John and the IPCC and thought this is the wrong way of tackling the problem. And what we should be using is this all this interest in climate change to try and understand all the stuff that human resource management is getting wrong. And the focus that's wrong. And the focus, when we tried to push that, John stayed on to try and do it from the inside of the IPCC. And others like to left because it was too hard to put up with the same bullshit until all the time.
Because they were still trying to solve.
Yeah, I mean, actually, my experience is part of that population that stayed in the IPCC for the next 15 years and kept finding away the same framing of the problem, not recognizing that attacking the climate change task was not at all the right way to go about solving it. Now, actually, I'm going to ask the question less of this.
Okay.
Are you musicians in this exercise? Musicians or general public?
They are musicians.
Okay, so where did you get the expertise?
Because I think that the idiom that they were working with was, I mean, even the most sort of responsive, imminent improvisers make a whole lot of agreements and come up with a whole lot of decisions before they start to improvise. They're already within a structured context.
Yeah.
And what the composer did in this case was actually neutralize that context as much as he could by not giving them any kind of shared language or form or structure, harmonic patterns, anything. No, they weren't. They were all classical players. Yeah, so that's what was wrong. But again, what they would be doing is they would be awaiting a structure to be imposed on them, in some sense. Well, I mean, I think the Toys R Us example is good, where they lay a keyboard along the floor of Toys R Us, and eventually you can hear some music being made. And so that's why I thought that was so interesting, where if you, I mean, at that point, maybe it's a question of scale, because you had 4 musicians on the floor and you had 7 scattered on the balconies of Sir, and you had an audience that could interact, like there were, I think, 30 or 40 people wandering through these boxes. So if it's an issue of scale, maybe that's one of the problems. 1 musician and 1 person, maybe you could get something out of that. But I think what was interesting about that for me was more just the composer's faith. First of all, the composer's desire to abandon post that thoroughly, to leave that sort of modernist notion of I'm the composer channeling music from the heavens, for this other idea that's heavily normative, that no, music needs to come from a good place, it needs to come from a democratic place, and try and extricate himself from the process so thoroughly, with the idea that then something good will come of it because the process itself is virtuous. And the absolute sort of opposite effect that had on the audience. Rather than it being a metaphor for agency, it was the metaphor for a total lack of agency. Yes?
Does this seem like it's more of a, we talk about like authors long, modernist dichotomy a lot.
Yeah.
These dichotomies are there for purposes to, you know, like the distinction between subjective and objective, or whatever kind of have purposes. So, kind of comprehend the world better. Because whenever we transfer knowledge, there's always going to be a disconnect between what's real and what is going around.
Mm.
Now, this idea of moving to like an imaginary world, I think that might be okay for North America or what have you, but I was listening to a lot of music from Iran, a lot of music from Nigeria, and Africa, and this dichotomy is very important for them to show that we live in a material world with a lack of material things. And I think you can't go too far with this idea of like imaginary world, because like Dale Carnegie is a world-renowned African artist, and he made that distinction. He wrote a song that's just about shit. That's what it's about. And
Shit?
shit, yeah. And this guy, yeah. But it's but it was to show like, you know, Nigerians had to transport like colonial like experts and Japanese as well. Constantly like there was like dichotomy, and he's very influential in Nigeria as well.
Right.
Even though Ghana performed in opera, and because of his performance it influenced the black in opera. So that dichotomy is important for
I'm just not catching exactly why the way in which the dichotomy is present in these contexts that you're illustrating.
he's the artist who is controlling the situation.
Right.
He's saying the world needs to change. And also saying, you know, physical reality that we're suffering right now.
Right.
Truly, and we need to change that.
That needed to be translated into a semiotic fabric that needed to exist in a song for that riot to happen, right? Yeah, so to me that's the translation of it into the imaginary world. That's what I would say that artist is able to do. So I think it's entirely consistent with what I'm saying. There was a hand behind the microphone, but I can't. Oh, hi Terry. Okay. Right. Right. You used an adjective, something, those people. Yeah, right. 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 So with regard to the question of agency, yeah, I actually didn't realize that could also mean like the Department of Fisheries or something like that. I just mean it, and as I said to you before, I'm frustrated that I don't have more of a textured, layered sense of how to use that word, because I think even within my own use, it's not entirely consistent. But just the capacity to be to be able to do things, to be able to affect change, to be able to engage with one's context or another in some way that you have some level of control, some level of self-determination, I guess would be the driest answer. And in terms of the flip and the whole idea of sort of flipping the sustainability predicate and how that engages with the arts, there's this really tenacious assumption, and we were dealing with this just last week, somebody that is working in an NGO context and just has such an intense desire to just see a real big phase shift and want to create sort of, large-scale change. And I think we just come off as flaky, like we just come off as sort of people who are like, hey man, it's going to be okay kind of thing. And that's not actually what we mean. And I sort of wanted to kind of step into that conversation and say, well, let's make a bet then. Like, let's make a bet on really instrumental terms. That's either sort of creating a very instrumental engagement using the arts to tackle issues of behavior change. How effective is that going to be in producing the result that you want versus how much can we sort of step back and engage it in this as a kind of larger existential project? Which of those is going to actually meet this larger goal that you've identified as a sort of instrumental need to exact change right away? One thing that I left out of this presentation is that this comes on the back of a lot of frustration with the art sustainability relationship. So if we track it historically, in the 90s, there was just a sense that the arts were going to come in and bulldoze unsustainability out of there, and this would just be a complete change once we brought the arts into the question, and that didn't happen at all. And so that whole sort of front-end piece about how we're using the arts was, in a sense, trying to respond to the fact that it had broken down, that it had sort of, there was a level of disillusionment around the art sustainability relationship because I think it pursued such a sort of direct grasp for that low-hanging fruit. Do you have a follow-up or no? Kai? Okay. Okay. Please do though then. Okay.